Hi, everyone. I'm McKenna. I'm the owner of Murder by the Book in Houston, Texas. And I'm very excited this evening, Friday evening, to be talking with two of my favorite authors under the Soho umbrella. We've been big fans of both at the store for a really long time, and I'm looking forward to this conversation because they're both so intelligent and witty, and I'm sure it's going to be just a delight to listen to. So we'll be joined by James R Benn and Francine Mathews in just a second. As always, if you are interested in more information about the books or the authors, their other works, you can click the link. I'm sorry, my dog has decided to bark in this one moment. You can click the link that I've already put in the comments. You can find, like I said, information about the new books there as well. And if you're so inclined, you can order them from us, which we would greatly appreciate. Also, if you have questions for either author, don't be shy. You can pop those in the comments on Facebook or the live chat on YouTube, and we'll get to those in a little bit. We have just scheduled a bunch of new events for October, including some pretty cool multi-author panels. I'll be getting those up on Facebook shortly. And our full event listing is on our website, murderbooks.com. All right. So now for the stars of the show, we're going to start with James Benn. Hi, how are you? And look at your Murder by the Book pandemic t-shirt.
Hey,
yep. Looking great. How are you this evening?
I'm just fine. I'm excited to be here. And maybe next year in person, but we're doing the best we can.
The only thing that would be better is if we could actually have you here in person. You're here tonight to talk about Road of Bones, the new Billy Boyle mystery. And I'm going to go ahead and do your formal introduction, and then we'll bring on Francine Mathews. Excellent. Thank you for having that. I do so many of these now at home that I had just started taking books back and forth and back and forth. So now I'm dependent on the authors to hold up their own books, it's sad to say, but I'm glad you had it. Okay, so James R. Benn is the author of the Billy Boyle World War II mysteries. The debut, Billy Boyle, was selected as a top 5 book of the year by BookSense and was a Dilys Award nominee. A Blind Goddess was longlisted for the IMPAC Dublin Literary Award. The Rest is Silence was a Barry Award nominee, and The Devouring was a Macavity Award nominee. Ben, a former librarian, splits his time between the Gulf Coast of Florida and Connecticut with his wife, Deborah Mandel. Again, good to have you here tonight. And bring on Francine. Hi, how are you?
Hey, Francine.
Hi, Jim.
So good to see you, Francine Mathews, aka Stephanie Barron. It's nice to have you here, and thank you so much for agreeing to be here and chat with Jim tonight. So I'm going to do your formal intro as well and leave you guys to it. Francine Mathews has spent part of 50 summers on Cape Cod and Nantucket. She attended Princeton and Stanford Universities, where she studied history before going on to work as an intelligence analyst at the CIA. She wrote her first book in 1992 and left the agency a year later. Since then, she's written 27 books, including 4 previous novels in the Merry Folger series, as well as the nationally best-selling Being a Jane Austen mystery series, which she writes under the pen name Stephanie Barron. She lives and works in Denver, Colorado. And I think maybe this bio is outdated because Death on Tuckernuck was not in there. So I think there's more books than I just introduced. But your most recent was Death on Tuckernuck, and we will hear more about what you're working on in a little bit. Okay.
But we're really here to talk about Jimmy right now.
Yeah, absolutely. But
sounds good.
We'll spend a little time on you when I come back. Again, don't forget, if you're watching, put those questions in there. I know we've got a couple good question askers already watching, so I'll be looking for the comments. All right, have fun.
Thanks, McKenna.
Oh, Jim, it feels like way too long since we've seen each other, and I keep feeling like we should be wearing conference paddles around our neck.
Right, yeah.
That's where we always cross paths.
Or at a bookstore somewhere.
Yeah, we're at a bookstore or on Twitter, which, of course, is where I feel like I've had my most recent conversations with you.
Right, yeah.
Well, congratulations on Road of Bones.
Thank you.
I have been reading it 2 ways. I read it actually in the ARC that I received a couple of months ago, but also I have been listening to the Audible, which is fascinating for me because it drove home to me how much dialogue your books sustain. Your books are almost perfectly translatable to film, I think, because they are driven so completely by both action on a constant basis and conversation. There's very little wasted narrative in your writing, which, is something of a masterclass in itself for a writer as reader. But this is the 16th Billy Boyle. And for those who are new to the series, could you catch us up basically on the concept that you began with and where you've brought it to now?
Sure. Basically, I'm going to make a very long story short, but I got the idea for this series in 1972 when I went to see The Godfather.
Wow.
And the opening scene is that garden party where Sonny's getting married, right?
Yeah.
And Michael Corleone is there in his Marine Corps uniform, medals all over the place, and everybody's ignoring him because he was the sap that went and fought for the government. And it's all about family with the Sicilians. And that stuck with me for years, the idea of this insular clan who is looking out for their own and views the white sheep as the sucker in the family. So I didn't do anything about that for 30 years, but it always stayed with me. So when I started looking for the idea for a series, Italian mafia, Irish cops, okay, pretty close match there. Very insular community.
You're Irish or Italian.
And in terms of how they view the outside world, let's put it that way. So I came up with this idea of this young police detective in Boston who got his job because his uncle was on the promotions board. And when war breaks out, this staunchly Irish Republican family does not want their son to go off and die for the British Empire. That's how they view things. And they are related through his mother's side to a little-known officer, Colonel Dwight David Eisenhower, who actually had just been promoted to general when Pearl Harbor hit. And they get him appointed to Eisenhower's staff, thinking he can sit out the war in Washington, D.C. Billy Boyle, the titular character. They pull a few strings with the Kennedys and get him appointed. And what they don't know is that Eisenhower has just been tapped to go to Europe, head up the U.S. Army at first. And he takes Billy with him, thinking he's got an experienced detective, when in reality he's got a 20-year-old crony who got his job after graft and corruption. But Billy loves his Uncle Ike. He wants to do right. And he's also smart enough to not want to be sent to the front to be killed. So he does his best to solve crimes that affect the military. And he's Eisenhower's sort of a secret investigator, and that allows me to send him anywhere I want within Eisenhower's jurisdiction, which only grows throughout the war. So he's a troubleshooter for Ike, basically. And as the series moves on, he grows into the role, even still not wanting to get himself killed. That's a big priority for Billy.
It's amusing because the whole opening sequence of events in Road of Bones is basically Billy trying to avoid getting killed.
Yeah.
And it brought me back to my own father, who was in the Army Air Corps in World War II, but also was trying hard to avoid being killed, and spent a lot of the war flying Churchill and dignitaries who visited DC out of Bowling Air Force Base, and cabinet members. And he was basically an elite VIP pilot during the war.
Excuse me, would you mind if he's a character in a book?
Oh, not at all.
That'd be fun.
You could have my fun. Yeah. He ended up a general in the Air Force, but he basically was.
I won't hold that against him.
No, he was basically avoiding being killed in the whole war. And, his stories of that are kind of priceless, because you realized a lot of people were doing that. So Billy has this wonderful quality of integrity, I think, because he is always true to his investigation. He wants the truth. He doesn't compromise justice. He can never be bought off figuratively or literally. But his own motives are not particularly, inhuman, by which I mean he is subject to the human fear of death. So you have taken him in a not sequential way through the war. Could you comment on that?
Well, I'm trying to come to grips with that, because as the series moves on, the war is winding down. Although if you were there in the fall of 1944, you wouldn't think of it that way. But I'm trying to cram as much in, and I have stepped out of the timeline with the Jack Kennedy book, but I think I've tied myself recently to a sequential series, and there's a challenge in that, because you've got to look around for an interesting historical reality in October 1944. So the past few books, I've been a little more vague than I have in the past about the exact date.
About the exact date,
yeah. So we're not going to worry about that too much. But
well, I think it's interesting to me, because I similarly have gone through a fixed period of time with a character.
Right. Yep.
In this case, Jane Austen, not my Meredith Folger series, but the Jane series. I've had to be cognizant of the fact that she died young, and you run out of your allotted span, as it were. But I also think your case is particularly challenging, because for those reading now who are younger than you and I, World War II is starting to feel like a past century event. And a few big dates stick in people's minds: Pearl Harbor, D-Day. Getting into the nitty-gritty of Tehran, which I've done myself in a book, Too Bad to Die, or the reality of the Russian allies working with American pilots within Ukraine and, parts of Western Russia, is something that most people won't know. So I was fascinated reading this at just how much you had to research and master in order to get certain things right, like what it's like to be under strafing fire in a C-470 or in a bomber, or what it physically must have been like to stand in the cheek of the bomber with a gun in your hands and be trying to pivot to follow German planes circling you. What it felt like to travel over that period of time in freezing temperatures in the bay of a plane that was not pressurized across Europe. And the reality of seeing a plane next to you shot down and knowing that everybody in that plane, like everybody in yours, is screaming as they die. So you had to research all of that, but you also had to research the NKVD, which is not an easy task. You had to research the conditions on the ground at the airbase where you bring your Russians and Americans together. And I have more questions that I'd like to get to in a minute about how you structured this book. But first of all, just talk to us a little bit about how much you had to master to write this.
Well, for a long time, I'd wanted to tell the story of the air war in a visceral sense. I wanted that first chapter. I've been looking for a way to write that for a long time. And it was only the past few years that my wife discovered through somebody doing genealogy that she had a cousin, a generation older, but that her family is Jewish. Most of them who stayed in Europe were killed. The people that came here before the war scattered. So they just kind of came together recently. And her cousin Abe was a crewman on a B-17. He lost his thumb to flak. And
I thought you were going to say frostbite.
Yeah, well, it probably would have been not as painful. But cousin Abe is the one who told me the story about jumping up and down on a stuck bomb in the bomb rack. He did that. And when I heard that story, I just was certain that has to be in a book.
Yeah, you have to.
That was just incredible. And to think of these guys, really young guys, 5 miles up, 40 degrees below zero, 60 degrees below zero, the wind howling, people shooting at you, and you've got a stuck bomb, and you've got to jump up and down on it, and it might blow up. It is incomprehensible. But I wanted to somehow tell that story. And it was this documentary, The Cold Blue, that William Wyler, who made the documentary during the war about the Memphis Belle, had a lot of unused footage. And it sat in the National Archives for decades. Somebody discovered it, and they put together a documentary, interviewed surviving veterans. And it really brought home to me that cold, because that was pervasive. And you never see, you watch old TV shows or some movies, even 12 O'Clock High, which is a very good film. They don't give you a sense of that frigid cold and what that must have been like. So having all that come together just almost made it easy to write that chapter, because I had all the information that I finally needed to have Billy witness what went on.
Did you watch video that may survive of the interior of those planes?
Yes, and there's actually a few good websites that are interactive where you can go literally walk, virtually walk through a B-17, and it's so cramped, and it's unbelievable how little room these guys have. Most of the time, they couldn't wear their parachutes because they wouldn't fit. If you were the ball turret gunner or the rear gunner, you put it on a hook, and you were lucky if you got into it when you needed to. We think of World War II almost as sort of a modern war with these sleek aircraft, but they were wide open. I mean, those side gunners, those are big open windows. It's just
freezing, big open windows.
Yeah.
Freezing wind tearing in. Yeah.
So, and then once we get on the ground in the Soviet Union, how to convey the paranoia and the talk about an insular nature of people. It really beckoned the imagination to try to see how they lived with that in relation to foreigners and each other. Who could you trust? I just got the sense that the Soviets always thought Joe Stalin was in the next room listening in. And
he wasn't. His tape recorders were.
Yeah, well.
Not tape, but yes. I mean, I think microphones. Something that struck me, though, was the unique aspect of having American allies and coordinating in a chain of command with Soviet brass.
Yeah.
But also on the common soldier level, that you had Russian soldiers and American sort of co-working on this base, which has to have thrown into sharp relief the differences culturally and materially between them. And you kind of bring that home with certain characters who are black marketeers.
Right, yeah.
And they're working both sides. They're selling American condoms and nylons and bourbon to Russians for rubles, and then they're taking the rubles into town and buying Nazi war relics to sell to American GIs who want to show that when they go home they fought the Germans.
Pure capitalism. Just perfect.
Yeah. Which is fascinating on a lot of levels. But the book kind of has two main themes. One being the story of Frantic. I don't know how much you want to talk about spoilers or what, but there's that whole thread about a massive Allied operation that's about to get underway. And then the story of the Night Witches. And I'm curious which theme you decided you were working with first in this book.
The first theme was how to pursue the truth, because the setup for this is Billy Boyle is that the reason he's in this B-17, he's got to get to this air base where there's been a double murder.
And where is the air base?
In Poltava, Ukraine, in the Soviet Union. And he's got to fly over Germany, hitch a ride on a bomber that's headed to this base, where there's been 2 people murdered, an NKVD agent and an American intelligence officer. And the Soviets and the Americans decide, let's have a joint investigation. And of course, the Russians rule out the possibility that a Russian did it. So it's preordained it'll be an American who is found guilty. And his partner, his Russian partner, knows that if he doesn't deliver on that, he's going to be sent back to a prison camp. And that sort of duality of pursuing the truth in an environment, it's like a double-edged environment. It's wartime, so you want to protect the truth, but it's the Soviet Union, so there's only Stalin's truth.
Well, what is truth?
Yeah, right, yeah, whatever Joe says.
Yeah.
And I wanted to put Billy in that position so we could explore all that and explore the everything from the really pure of heart Russians who were defending the motherland against the invader. I mean, that was genuine patriotism, heroism. The Night Witches just are an exemplar of that. These were women night bombers that were part of a 3-regiment, all-female group of bombers, fighters, and night bombers. And the Night Witches had the roughest assignment because they were given old, outdated biplanes. And their job was to bomb the German positions at night with no instrumentation, no radios, nothing but dead reckoning navigation. And their job was to just keep them off balance, keep them wondering when these Night Witches, Nachthexen, were going to glide in with their engines cut. The only sound they made was the thrum of the wires between the 2 wings, which is how the Germans thought of them as witches, the sound a broom might make. And they flew sortie after sortie. They would 5 or 6 missions a night. And there was a bounty on their heads. The Germans hated them. When they called them Nachthexen, Night Witches, it wasn't a term of respect. There was a bounty on their heads. And
They were really
course,
demons in the German mentality.
Yes, yeah. And I think some of it is
they flew at low altitude, correct?
very low, very low.
And it was designed to get under the radar.
Yeah. And the navigator in the back seat who guided the pilot by dead reckoning was surrounded by flares. And her job was to light a flare, throw it out so it would illuminate the target. So she's surrounded by all this flammable stuff in an old canvas biplane that's got a gas tank that could go up at any minute. And they're shooting from the ground. I mean, a rifle shot could take them down. And they knew that if they were captured, they knew what would happen to them. And their sidearms were mainly issued to them so they could kill themselves before they were captured. Right. Really, a incredibly brave and dedicated bunch of women. And as is so often with women fighting in the Second World War, when victory came, they were shunted aside. There was a huge victory parade in Moscow, and these 3 regiments were not invited. They were disbanded immediately, told to go back home and make babies and work in factories. And so it was a story that needed to be told, and it has been. I think in the past 20 years or so, books have started to come out featuring the Night Witches and telling their story in different ways.
But was that what compelled you as you sat down to write Road of Bones? Or was it the idea of Operation Frantic, or was it the Road of Bones? I mean, there's all these elements going on in the book, and I don't want to spoil it for readers who haven't read it yet, but there are multiple storylines in a fairly complex and sophisticated integration here. So
yeah, Operation Frantic, the concept behind having American bases on Soviet soil was just a platform to tell the story. Now, there were political issues there too, but aside from that, I really wanted to take a look at what the role of women in the Soviet Union and their fight was. So we've got not only the Night Witches, but Maya, the translator that,
Wow.
is an escort for Billy and his crew. So their story and the Road of Bones is worth a mention because the title comes from a 1,000-kilometer road from the Pacific coast, from a port city inland, that Stalin had built by his political prisoners. This was done in the 30s, just before the war, and he had hundreds of thousands of prisoners from all his purges and political trials. And they gave them shovels and pickaxes in the frozen tundra and had them hack out a road. And they didn't keep records, but they estimate between 250,000 and 1 million political prisoners died building that road. And
these are Russians.
Internal prisoners, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's Road of Bones because with kind of a brutal efficiency, when a prisoner died, they didn't bother hacking out a grave out of the frozen ground. They were already digging the road, so they put the body in the roadbed. Today, this road is still there. It's one of the most dangerous roads in the world. It's mostly a dirt road, and the bones are still rising up out of the roadbed, just like stones come up. And so it's routinely you'll see a skull appear or a femur.
Wow.
So a country that would do that to its own people, it raises some interesting questions about who we're allied with. What does that mean for our own morality? Do we sacrifice thinking about that for the greater good? The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
That was certainly, to me, the case in World War II. I mean, to me, the whole alliance between Britain and Russia is purely a bed of convenience. And we came along for the British ride with the Allied, Russians in that sense. And I think that plays out incredibly brutally in the post-war defection of British spies from primarily MI5, who, were told to give information to the Russians when they were allies and continued doing it after World War II. And suddenly in 1948, they're realizing that they've committed treason.
Yeah.
That the qualification of what an ally is shifts so constantly for political reasons. And we see that today in the U.S. So it's not a problem that's gone away. It's one that's just changed its shape. So question for you. You have several beloved characters in this series, and they're constantly in harm's way. How do you as an author deal with the decision about the reality of life and death for your characters?
It's a few years ago, I toyed with the idea of, I don't know if I could do anything with Kaz, but Big Mike.
But he has a heart condition, Jimmy.
Yeah, right. Poor guy.
He's just one arrhythmia away.
So I was thinking about Big Mike, and if you've noticed in the past few books, he's had a lot of injuries, and I think that's my way of saying he really ought to be dead by now.
Don't get attached.
Yeah, right. People have been asking me about writing to the end of the war and will Billy stay, and I'm beginning to see some trouble for Kaz because there was a whole movement in Poland of resisting the Russians. The men of the forest, they called them. They took to the forest to fight the Russians just like they had fought the Germans.
Yeah.
I have a sense that something not good is going to happen at the end of the war, which gives Billy a reason to stay in Europe post-war. But and I think also I've sublimated some of that through the psychic cost that Billy has been paying over the past few books. So he is suffering from combat fatigue. He really does have issues. And I think since I can't kill him unless I want to end the series, he's going to have to suffer with that. The last book, The Red Horse, was sort of the lowest point for him.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think one issue I have with crime fiction novels sometimes is the ease at which characters endure violence and act out violence without it affecting them. I mean, it's crime fiction, so there's going to be violence, but when they just are done, it's like, what's for dinner? That doesn't sit well with me. And I want to show there's a psychic impact on either witnessing violence, enduring violence yourself, committing violence, and that bill has to be paid. And in the Red Horse, last year's book, Billy ends up also, he had a little too much methamphetamine in Paris, in a rest home, let's say, and he has to recover from that. But that stays with him, and he talks about that in the first chapter of this book, that I really shouldn't be up here in this B-17. And I think since I don't know what a lot of readers would think, I don't know what I would think, I don't know what my editors would think if I killed off one of the big three, but I think having them suffer emotionally and spiritually is the way to deal with that when you basically want to keep the story going.
Right.
And have it be realistic.
But you owe a debt to realism. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I was thinking about your KGB character, who you present in the series in one moment when he is suave and a diplomat in London. And then when we re-encounter him, he has been tortured in Siberia and he is a very different person.
Yeah.
And you bring home the difference somewhat complexly in Billy's reaction to him, because Billy had reason to hate him. And he consistently keeps reminding himself, Billy, this guy's a murderer.
Yeah.
Except he feels such empathy for him because he can tell that the man is A, terrified, B, would rather die than go back, and C, has suffered enormously.
Right.
So it's a physical manifestation of something that's kind of rumored about the Soviet Union, if you're American, but which you cannot fathom happening to you as a citizen of a country. So, you handle that in multiple ways, that kind of...
And even when Kaz, he comes on the scene a little later in the book, and he sort of slaps Billy around and say, remember who this guy is. Right. Remember what he did. Right. And he holds
because Kaz
no sympathy for him. He was,
Kaz had more to lose. Yeah. My son, my younger son, was for a couple of years a Division I athlete, and he had to quit his sport because he's been concussed so much. And I often think that when I'm reading crime fiction, because people will be knocked out or simply battered by being beaten up. And it's like the next day they're fine. And watching somebody recover from a concussion, it's 6 months. It's not pretty. It's agonizing, and it's pervasive. So
actually, it's funny because today my wife is reading through and editing the book I'm about to turn in for next year. And she said, wait a minute, wasn't he in an explosion yesterday? And you've got him driving a Jeep in the mountains. I don't think he should be driving.
He's suffering TBI.
Yeah. Okay, all right, we got to fix that. Yeah. But it's easy when you're writing just to fall into, well, that was last chapter, and now we just have to get moving. Right. So it's something to pay attention to, and it deserves to be paid attention to.
Yeah, I had to deal with that just as a side story. I had to deal with that a lot in my book about Jack Kennedy, Jack 1939, because I emphasized throughout the book that he was constantly sick.
Yeah.
And so I have to have him taking time in the plot just to not be sick, to get better, to recover enough that he can keep going. And that was a weird thing to work with because it slows the pace of the story, potentially.
Yeah.
Unless it becomes actually the motive force of the story.
Now, how does that play out with Jane Austen and her illness?
Yeah.
I don't know when it manifests itself in her real life, how long it took. Yeah. That's it, huh?
So, that book is coming out in February, and it's set during what is called the Year Without a Summer, which was 1816. And it was season after a volcanic eruption in Indonesia.
Oh, is that Krakatoa?
No, it was Mount
okay.
Tambora, but it caused a global dust cloud in 1815 that actually caused famine by 1816 in Europe and the United States. And it's noted mostly for the summer that Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, because she and Percy Bysshe and Byron were all huddled around the fire because it was so freezing off Lake Geneva and in the northern Italian lakes, because the weather was so bad. It was rained incessantly. It was freezing. Nothing grew. So that was the summer that Jane got sick, and she died the following year. But we're not here to talk about that.
Okay.
But that's.
But it's the same kind of issue. You've got to deal with the physical reality of her illness. Right?
Yeah, in this book, she is getting sick, and it's a constant factor in the plotting. And in fact, the book is set at a Cheltenham spa where she went to try to get her health back. So, it's the framework of the story. Yeah. Should we open up at this point, do you think, for questions? What would you like to do? Or can I ask you one last question?
Sure.
You mentioned turning in the next book, so I don't want to, get ahead of ourselves, but where is Billy?
Well, I'm very excited about this one because we are
always are.
This is the one you're working on. I'm talking about Road of Bones, but I'm actually working on this one. It's called Shadows. And very briefly, if you haven't heard the song that Leonard Cohen made famous, The Partisan, you can Google that. You can go on YouTube. It's a song that was commissioned by the French government in exile. It was called The Partisan Song and The Partisan Lament. And they broadcast it into France, and it became so popular that people would whistle it going up and down the street just to signal that, I'm sympathetic to the resistance.
I'm a partisan.
And it's about men will come from the shadows. And it also talks about after the war, will still be in the shadows. It's very haunting. But anyway, it's going to involve the resistance, the aftermath of the fighting, but also the Japanese-American 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which was recruited American citizens, recruited from the concentration camps that we put them in after they were taken away from the West Coast. It was the most highly decorated unit in the United States Army per capita. And they rescued a battalion, very famously called the Lost Battalion, from behind enemy lines. And Billy will witness that. I didn't want him to be part of that because it's their story. It's the story of the nice side. But he has to go find two French scouts who are working with them. So he gets to witness that. And that's another story that just needs to be told and told over and over again. So we'll be in southern France. We'll be in Crete. A little Mediterranean tour.
Great, I'm in.
and one concussion.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you want me to, read that for a manuscript for accuracy, I'm all over.
Okay. All right. So that's what's coming up next. McKenna.
Excellent. Hi. So we do have a question, our two-part question from one of our regulars, Susan. And this is for both of you. Francine, I was going to let you talk about that Stephanie Barron book a little, but I think you've already mentioned it. Can you give us a little overview about your Nantucket series as well, if you don't mind?
Absolutely. I think it might be of interest in some respects to people in Houston, simply because the most recent book, Death on Tuckernuck, is actually about a hurricane and surviving a hurricane that comes ashore, makes landfall squarely over Nantucket, which has not happened, thankfully, but they have incredible readiness plans in place in the event that one does. So anyway, that was my scenario for Tuckernuck. I write a series. It was actually the very first novel I wrote 30 years ago, was called Death in the Off-Season. And I wrote it almost as a bet with my husband because I was working at the CIA at the time. And I had told him I really wanted to be, a writer. I was tired of wearing stockings and getting up and being in an office by 8, and I was always late. And, I was a miserable office worker. And so I just wanted to work at home and raise my own kids. The CIA was the first government agency to have a daycare center, but, it just seemed a little weird to me. To my kids would be in college saying, "Oh yeah, I went to daycare at the CIA." So I was trying to avoid that happening. But I wrote Death in the Off-Season as a mystery novel in a place I wanted mentally to live for the duration of the experiment of writing it, which was Nantucket in my mind. I thought it would be a great escape mentally. And I wanted to depict someone who straddled both cultures that make the island, namely the natives who've been there for 400 years, generationally, and the influx of tourists, because both groups think that they own the island. And in many cases, the people who come in as, quote, tourists, people I'm calling tourists, actually do own a huge piece of the island. They own summer houses there. But their constituencies and their sense of stake, what they view as themselves as stakeholders is vastly different. The people who are the teachers and the cops and the firefighters and mow the lawns and staff the restaurants and serve as medical staff, importantly in a pandemic right now, are very different from the ultra wealthy who fly in and on their private jet with their personal chef and open that particular house among their 7 houses for 3 weeks in August and then leave. So to me, that clash of cultures is fascinating, because where you have that kind of clash, you have conflict. And when you have conflict, you often have violence, murder. So my character is a female detective on the Nantucket police force. Her father, at the outset of the series, is her police chief. She's from a family that founded the island. And she's cutting her teeth in the initial books. By the book I have just written, Death on Tuckernuck, by the close of the novel, she is promoted in a fairly significant way. And her investment in the island only increases with time, I would say. So I'm actually writing the next book in that series, which deals with the pandemic on the island. And of course, it was a fascinating time because Nantucket Hospital is brand new in terms of it was vastly rebuilt and refurbished and amped up, but there's no ventilator. So you have to be flown to Mass General, medevaced if you are dying of COVID. What they experienced, I'm sure you've seen in Connecticut, Jimmy, is so many people have made Nantucket, when they have a second home or a fifth home there, their refuge for the pandemic. They've moved on island. And so suddenly all these people from elsewhere have strained the resources of the island that really are intended for the people who live there year round. And they're exposing everybody to risk. So it's been kind of this fraught bubble, if you will. And I'm looking forward to dealing with that in the next Nantucket mystery.
May I ask a question about Death on Tuckernuck?
Absolutely.
So there's a football player, a very self-centered, rich football player whose initials are TB. Was that intentional?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's great.
Yeah. That came, Jim, from, so Tuckernuck, I should explain, is a barrier island to the west of the western tip of Nantucket that is not accessible by any public transportation. It's about 900 square acres, and there are 40 houses roughly on the island. The entire island is privately owned. And to get to it, you have to have your own form of transportation, i.e. a boat, or you have to have a service that you've hired seasonally to get you there. Additionally, that service sustains your life on the island because there is no gas station, there is no single restaurant, there are no paved roads, there's no grocery shopping, there's no trash. So everything on the island has to be catered. All of your groceries are brought in. The houses have generators, but it's a very sustained artificial existence. It was not always that way. It used to be a year-round community, but none of the houses now are winterized, and the island is shut down Columbus weekend every October. And it doesn't open up until May. And so I looked at that isolation and the fact that because it's privately owned, the police have to be called to respond. The Coast Guard has to be called to respond. The fire department, if fire hits the island, there's no fire department. And that means fire boats. So, and it's an island that's surrounded by sandbars, so it's constantly silting closed its only harbor. And my intro into that idea of what would happen if there were a hurricane, and in the hurricane, the Coast Guard has to respond to a beached boat. And when they get to the boat, there's a dead body on it. There's a murder. I just wanted to use it for that location because the location and the logistics it demands to me was fascinating. And I wanted to imagine how Mary would handle that. But my intro or my access point to the life on Tuckernuck was spending time with the caretakers, who are the people whose professional business it is to go back and forth 4 times a day with groceries, pulling off garbage. They do things like bring over I-beams if there's a house being constructed on a barge. They have brought 125 wedding guests for a wedding, along with porta-johns, the flowers, caterers, the tables. I mean, the stuff they do is unbelievable, but they also know the intimate details of every life on that island in a way that no one else does, which is fascinating to me. So Jim, to get back to your question about the famous quarterback and his Brazilian wife who are living on Tuckernuck in one of their houses, that came from an ad I saw in Boston Magazine for a 6-bedroom compound site on Tuckernuck, pre-approved by the Historic Commission on Nantucket, plans for a generator, plans for a caretaker cottage. I mean, it was basically this whole spread. And to me, that was fascinating because the island has always been very closed to interlopers. It is an island related by marriage among its families over generations. People band together and buy properties if they're going to pass out of a family through inheritance and convert them to open space. They don't want outsiders. And somebody in there has broken that code and is selling large pieces of property for vast sums. And eventually Tuckernuck will be one of these places where you have your own landing strip, your own helipad, and you fly in directly to Tuckernuck and your caretakers take care of you. And it will be the most incredible gated community on the Eastern Seaboard. So I felt we were watching that start to end. I'm sorry, McKenna, that was way too long.
No, it's fascinating.
No, it's fascinating.
Yeah, totally fascinating.
It's a great book. It's just it's a window into a community that is unique.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It took me a year to figure out how to crack the Tuckernuck nut, how to get on the island, how to talk to people.
Well, I'm sure the point that you made about the caregivers know everything that's happening because they deal with the trash, they deal with the food that comes in, they deal with like all of that. So they have the insight to what's happening. That's an amazing perspective too to explore.
Yeah, it was fun.
Yeah, I bet. Okay. We do have a question, but I'm going to ask one of my favorite questions to ask, which is of both of you. We'll start with Jim. So what books did you read in your formative years? So you can take that however you want, like high school, college. And when did you want to be a writer? And was there one book that made you think like, I want to be a writer?
You know, I just put away a file and I wish I had it to hold up. I wrote a story in 5th grade English class about a sergeant dropped behind the lines before D-Day. And I must have saved it because of the teacher's comments. She said, good writing, but you made it a little too easy for the sergeant. So that was in 5th grade. And it was such a great writing lesson because you can't make it too easy for the sergeant. You know, there's got to be obstacles. So I've always wanted to be a writer. You know, Francine talked about wanting to work at home, write at home, not go to the office. I hated going to work. I changed jobs a lot thinking, well, it's okay for a while, but I get bored. I'll go to another job. But when I was able to retire early, it was like the happiest day of my life. I can just write. I read a lot of history. I can remember in high school reading Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I read a lot of science fiction back then. Isaac Asimov and the Foundation trilogy and books like that. Just those stories enraptured me. And then at some point, I shifted over into mysteries and crime fiction, and English-based stuff. Dorothy L. Sayers was the first real English series that I read. I've read probably every one at least twice. And now I'm back to reading a lot of history and not reading as much fiction as I'd like to, because I'm just churning through historical books to find that little nugget, that little story that needs to be told. But I might have to go back to Isaac Asimov and read him for a while.
How about you, Francine?
Well, I firmly believe that all writers are born, that we are born cognitively wired to process experience through words. And I only really comprehend a lot of my experience after I've written about it. So I wrote journals as a kid. I wrote voluminous letters. I'm the last of 6 sisters, and we didn't have email, so I wrote letters constantly as a kid. I wrote a lot of short fiction when I was young, but also poetry. I was heavily influenced by a lot of different stuff. So J.R.R. Tolkien, I was obsessive about The Lord of the Rings. Read it probably 15 times.
Oh my gosh.
Just was deep into Middle Earth for a whole period of my middle school life. But I also read War and Peace when I was 10, only because
precocious.
I bring this up because it was actually so formative. Because the BBC in 1973, when I was 10, had a 13-part series on War and Peace on Masterpiece Theater. And Anthony Hopkins, very young Anthony Hopkins, was Pierre. And it was utterly compelling, but I, at 10, really wanted to know about the love affair between Natasha and Andre, and it was every Sunday, so I had to read ahead to get to the good parts. I skipped von Clausewitz on war passages, but read War and Peace, and suddenly put it together that it was the same period as this other book in England, Pride and Prejudice. Mm-hmm. That these things were happening at the same time on opposite sides of the globe. And, when you grew up in the 70s in America and you watch British television, there were only 2 periods: Queen Elizabeth, or Henry and his 8 wives, and the Victorian period. And so I was like, what is this 1815? What is the Regency? And I ended up studying Napoleonic France at Princeton. It became a really powerful fascination for me. I wrote my senior thesis on the French invasion of Russia in 1812. And so writing the Jane series was actually an absolute. I read a lot of mystery. So the Christie of when I was in 8th grade or something. One summer, book after book after book. I read Marjorie Allingham, who I love, Niall Marsh, who I love, Dorothy Sayers obsessively. So all of that comes together at a certain point. And I was a huge Bond film fan, hence the CIA, hence spy novels, because they are formative influences. You watch a Bond film and every Bond girl dies because she's wearing high heels in an inappropriate place, and she trips on her high heels and she says, "Oops!" And I kept thinking, looking at Bond films, don't wear the high heels. A. B, you got to know how to drive stick, because every getaway car in Europe is a stick shift car. It's one of the first things I did. I thought someday I'm going to be in a situation, this was long before I joined the CIA, but I thought someday I'm going to be in the situation where I'm only going to be able to escape death if I can drive stick. And I'm not going to know how, because I'm American. Taught myself to drive stick when I was 22, just so I was prepared.
You're ready.
Everything is formative.
Yeah, that's amazing. Great answers. Okay, so we have a crowd question here. So what is the best book you've received as a gift? And then a second question, what book did you feel like you were supposed to like but didn't? So maybe let's do the gift book first. Jim?
There's a book that actually relates to what Francine was talking about, and it's that I was given. It's called Envisioning Information. Author's name escapes me, but he has different graphics on how information is displayed, and he shows Napoleon's invasion of Russia on a map with these huge lines that demonstrate the size of his army. And as he goes to Moscow, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And then on the way back, there's this little thin line. And it was just a way that made quantitative information come alive.
Immediately graspable.
Yeah. So that was great. And the rest of it was a book that you should like, but
yeah. What's a book you feel like you were supposed to like, but you didn't?
Okay, time to move on to Francine while I think about that.
War and Peace, Jim. You didn't like
I was.
That question's tough. I mean, I'll get to the gift book first, but later. But the question about a book you were supposed to like and didn't is tough because you feel like you're impugning another writer.
Yeah.
And I always shy off from doing that.
I mean, I honestly would have bet that you would not answer it when I saw it come up. But I thought, I'm just going to put this out here and see what happens.
Life is too short.
Yeah.
Life is too short to disparage another writer who is doing their vision and their time.
I'll disparage a writer.
Okay.
We used to go on vacation before Kindle. We'd go to a paperback used bookshop, buy a bunch of paperbacks, take on vacation, sitting on the beach. Before I started writing, I'm reading this book about how Hitler escaped. This is fiction, but how Hitler escaped after World War II. He had plastic surgery, and this American secret agent took him on a boat across Lake Geneva and smuggled him into Switzerland. And I could remember lying on the beach of this book saying, I could write better than this. And my wife said, well, why don't you? So, that was a terrible book. I don't know who the author was, but it motivated me. It was so bad that I thought I could do better.
There you go.
And you did.
Yeah. Who couldn't?
All right, Francine, what's your gift book?
Gosh. Okay. I was in second grade. I went on the train, the New Haven line from Chappaqua, New York, into the city with my father. And it was night and it was winter. And he took me to Charles Scribner's bookstore on Fifth Avenue. And I don't know why he went there. My father worked at 40 Rockefeller Center at the time, 50 Rockefeller Center. And he must have had to buy a book for Christmas for somebody, but he bought me Joan Aiken's The Wolves of Willoughby Chase. And I read it all the way home on the train. And the book opens with a girl on a train getting trapped by a blizzard. And the wolves come and attack the train. And it's the most evocative, wonderful scene for a child to read in a way that was somehow not threatening. And that book became terribly important to me. But it's lingered in my memory because my father died when I was 14. And his gift to me of books, which happened periodically, was always memorable. He gave me The Grinch Who Stole Christmas when I was 4, and my mother was horrified because she thought it would give me nightmares. Just things that he understood that other people didn't necessarily, came out in the form of gift books.
Well, that was a wonderful, magical story. I have goosebumps. So I'm gonna close the show with that. We had some comments, but I think that was the only question. So thank you both so much for spending your evening with us. It has been wonderful. It was, as I knew it would be, delightful conversation between the two of you. Jim, congrats on the new book. As I said, there's a link in the comments for those of you watching if you want to order it. And if anyone is hearing about Francine Mathews for the first time. We highly recommend both of her series, her standalone thrillers. All the information about those in the link as well. So thank you both, and I'm going to sign us off for the night. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Nice seeing you,
Bye-bye.
Francine. Take care. Next
You
year in
too.
person.
Let's hope so.
Yes.